Welcome again to Fantastical Truth. This is a special bonus episode from the podcast from Lorehaven, where we find truth in fantastic stories. I am E. Stephen Burnett, the publisher of Lorehaven, free webzine available at lorehaven.com. We explored the Christian-made science fiction novel Oxygen with an old acquaintance of mine, Randy Ingermanson. He co-wrote that book with John B. Olson in the early 2000s. And we, in our episode, explored a retrospective of this now aborted timeline where NASA had sent a first man and woman mission to Mars. That didn't happen, alas. But if you read Oxygen, it did happen. And not only did this happen, but the mission did not go without a hitch. There was an explosion en route, and one of the 4 astronauts turned out to be possibly a saboteur. I loved that story when I first read it. And so if you want to hear more about that, go back to that episode of Fantastical Truth, exploring Oxygen with Randy Ingermanson. However, in that interview, we also went back to Randy Ingermanson's first love. He actually wants to be the novelist who is known for being a Tom Clancy-style thriller writer in first century Jerusalem. And his new series is actually called Crown of Thorns, which is a biblical fiction series. Biblical fiction is another one of my favorite genres, along with fantastical stories. For Randy, though, he's been used to combining the speculative elements, even some time travel in some of his earlier biblical fiction novels set in first century Jerusalem. This one, this new series, I don't think it has any time travel going on, but it does follow the adventures, the mission of Jesus Christ. Very speculative there, as Jesus is discovering in his humanity who he is and what he is sent to do, and a lot of the mission that he's been called to do in first century Jerusalem. The first novel, called Son of Mary, actually released on Palm Sunday, 2020. In the middle of the pandemic, Randy will describe a bit as to why he did that and what is going on with the series. We also talk a lot about biblical fiction as a genre, and in particular, what we do when we're reading the Gospels and seeing some details that might seem to be contradictory. Or what do Christians think about the Bible itself, and how can we enjoy and speculate about what truly happened in the Bible's true history through the genre of biblical fiction? Let's pick up with that interview now. Let's move on to the biblical fiction that you've written, Randy. You started with Transgression, as we mentioned. From there, you did 2 other books that continue that story. There's the City of God series called Premonition and Retribution. I really enjoyed those. Those continue what happens with Ari and Rivka as they are trapped in first century Jerusalem. The wormhole has winked out. And not only that, but the the invasion of Jerusalem in AD 70 is coming. Rivka knows her history as best she can, and so she actually takes on a bit of a role of a prophetess. Not sure if that violates the Federation's time travel prime directive there. She does her best to stay out of the way, but and every once in a while she might get something wrong. Those were really good, and they were also really gritty. Certainly from a Christian publisher. Remember in particular a crucifixion scene where you go through and portray exactly what happens.
Wow!
You lose control of your body, and
right.
It was tasteful. I feel now. But wow, that was some powerful stuff. I got to ask, as you look back on that, how you appreciated being able to spend more time there in the first century before coming back to it with the Crown of Thorns series.
Yeah, that series, actually Transgression, which was my first novel. Yes, it's a biblical novel, but when my publisher submitted it for the Christie Awards, I assumed they were going to put it in the historical category. They didn't. They put it in the futuristic category, which is strange to me because it's going back in time. But they put it in the science fiction-y category, and so it won, a Christie Award in the basically the sci-fi category at that time, rather than the historical thing. So it really it blends very nicely my sciencey stuff and my strong interest in history. But let me tell you why I'm so interested in this time period.
Please do.
So I think we all know that something major happened in the first century, right? Jesus came along, but there were two other major things that happened in the first century. One of them was the birth of another major world religion. That would be Rabbinic Judaism. So Rabbinic Judaism was born in the late part of the first century. Why was it born in the late part of the first century? Isn't Judaism an ancient religion that goes back to Abraham? Well, yes and no. Rabbinic Judaism, which is what we have to this day, came from the first century as a result of the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. There was no longer a temple. There could no longer be sacrifices. How could Jews continue to exist? Rabbinic Judaism was born out of that question. But, okay, so the destruction of Jerusalem, the destruction of the temple in the year 70 AD is tied very closely to Rabbinic Judaism. It's also tied very closely to Jesus, okay, because Jesus predicted the destruction of the temple, and clearly his conflicts with the powers that be were closely tied in to the powers in the temple, the Sadducees, and closely also tied into the Pharisees, who were the people who ultimately became the founders of Rabbinic Judaism. So there were three incredibly significant things that happened in the first century. There was the Jesus movement, Rabbinic Judaism, and the destruction of Jerusalem. They're all tied together in a very tight way. And I wanted to explore that in this series. I've understood that at some intuitive level now since the mid-'80s, but the more I learn about it, the more I recognize just how tightly those three things are tied together. My feeling is that there are elements of the New Testament we will never understand until we fully understand how those things are connected.
I really look forward to finding all of those little plot twists that God has reserved for himself. And then we'll get to just open our eyes wide as if we're getting a director's commentary. Wow, I never saw that before. And like all the top theologians in the world, they may have gotten fairly close to some of them, but just missed this one little one that just undergirds how amazing the plot was that God was putting together. Jesus, by the way, makes that prediction in Matthew 24. It's one of the saddest moments, I think, in the New Testament, where he says, "Do you see these stones? I tell you, not one of them will remain on top of the other."
Yes.
Yeah, the parallel text there. So that was, you jump ahead then to the New Testament, the era of the Acts of the Apostles in that series. And we even have the Apostle Paul, the Apostle James. I believe at the time they thought they had recovered his coffin with the name James on it. And that was part of the marketing for premonition, I believe. But then now switching over, what you're doing now is you're stepping back from the time travel, from the Acts of the Apostles, although I guess technically it could still be in continuity, because your next series, Crown of Thorns, I believe it's now released, and the book one anyway?
Right. Book one just released on Palm Sunday. So about, 2 or 3 weeks ago now?
Fantastic timing. And that actually, Jesus is the central figure there. I would love to hear a little bit about how long that has been in the making, going back to the earlier part of the first century, a more crucial part, obviously, because it's got the hero of heroes on center stage.
Right. So in the fall of 2004, my agent called me and says, "Hey, how would you like to write a novel about Jesus?" I go, "That sounds good." He says, "How would you like to co-author that with," and then he named a major big name person. I go, "Oh, that sounds good." And he says, "Look, we've got a publisher interested in this. Can you put together a proposal?" So I did. We wrote the proposal. My agent moved out of agenting and became a publisher, but his co-agent moved in, took control of it. We sold the deal to a publisher, and everything seemed great until I wrote the story. And then there were issues. I'm not going to go into those, but there were issues with, the co-author, and there were issues with the publisher, and eventually the deal just fell apart, and I was left with a manuscript that the publisher didn't want, but I owned the manuscript. My agent then tried to sell it to other publishers, and with only my name on the cover, people were a lot less interested. So I just told my agent, "Great, could I just take this? Can I just hold this in reserve for later?" And he said, "Sure." Eventually, as I started doing indie publishing, I talked to my agent again and says, can I just publish this as an indie project? And he says, no problem. It's all yours. You have complete rights to it. So I've been sitting on it for a long time, waiting for the time to be right. And about 5 or 6 years ago, I started actually making money with my City of God series as an indie series. That is, I re-released those books. They made me a fair bit of money, enough that I could go to Jerusalem and work on an archaeological dig. And, that's a lifelong dream of mine to do that. I spent a few weeks in Jerusalem and in Magdala on the Sea of Galilee. And I went back the next year, and I went back the next year. And again, last year, not this year, unfortunately, for several reasons. But I've now been to Israel 5 times. I've driven all around where things happen, and I've got a strong feel for the geography of the place, and geography really plays into story. And so finally, after years and years, it's now been more than 15 years since I got that call from my agent. I've finally released book 1 in the series, and I actually sent a complimentary copy of the ebook to that agent. He just emailed me yesterday and says he's reading it now. So it's been a long, long time in the making, but I think it's a much better book now than it was back in 2005, 2006, when things kind of fell apart. I think things happen for a reason. And that would have been a good book then. It's a much, much better book now. I just have a much deeper understanding of the story of Jesus. And one of the issues I've always had with the greatest story ever told, that's what they call it, the greatest story ever told, is that it's actually not a very good story in the technical sense that people teach you in writing school how to make a good story. Not much happens for 3.5 years, and then all of a sudden, boom, he's dead. Okay, what kind of a story is that, where all the action happens in the last week? Okay, and all that stuff in the middle of the 3 years where he's going around and doing stuff. A lot of that is actually kind of boring as it's portrayed in movies. I hate to say it, but I don't find most of the movies that I've seen on Jesus interesting. So I wanted to.
Well, it's very episodic. Yes.
Yeah.
It's trying to adapt it faithfully. It's very episodic.
Yeah. What's the connection between this and that? So I've tried to kind of figure out what are the connections, and that's a hard thing to do because the Gospels don't make it easy. The Gospels are written in a different genre than I'm writing. The Gospels are written in what at that time was a brand new genre. There had never been a gospel written until the 1st century. Obviously, these stories in the 1st century made an epic, just an intellectual earthquake in the Roman Empire. But things have moved on. We work in different genres today. We work in the genres of movies and novels, and the Gospels are not that genre. So what I want to do is now take that story and say, how can I recast that into the genres that 21st century people understand in a way that will resonate with 21st century people?
That's wonderful. Randy, I love how you said that geography informs so much about the stories that take place in the Bible and in the stories you're telling. My grandfather, Pops, a long time ago told me that when he went to the Holy Land, he said he could feel that it was a different place. And he just had this smile on his face, but it's like he couldn't even describe it. And as much as he tried to tell me about it, it just seems like such a special place. So it sounds like your experiences there have really informed your writing. So that's amazing.
Right.
You made reference to how there's so little recorded in the Gospels and how there's all these missing pieces that you wonder about. In our last episode, Steve and I talked about John 21:25, like the very last verse of the Gospel of John, where he says, Jesus did many other things too, which if they were all written down, the world couldn't contain all the books that would be written. And so, what we speculate about is that when we get to heaven or to the new earth, there will be books that we will get to read about all of the details of Jesus' life on earth. So if, Randy, here's my question for you. Which book would you pick up about Jesus' life? Like which of those missing stories would you want to read about?
The missing stories? Just so many. It's the gospel accounts are often just very disconnected. They're, as you said, highly episodic. It's just, I want to understand the timeline. I have a spreadsheet with basically every scene from the gospels, and I've been trying for years to figure out how it all fits together. What's the timeline? What happened first? At what point in the story does that terrible incident at Nazareth happen? Because it's unclear. In one of the Gospels, it looks like it happens basically right away. And in another one, it appears that it happens actually quite late in his career. So when did it happen? It makes a difference to the story in the way that you interpret things. So, I have to choose. At the end of the day, when you're writing a novel, you can't say, well, it's 30% likely that it happened here and 40% likely that it happened here. You have to choose. You have to nail it down to one particular date. You have to make a decision. When you're writing a novel, for sure you're just going to make all kinds of wrong decisions, and you have to live with that. I'm okay with that, but I'm trying to find something that gives me a coherent story from start to finish. So I've kind of cast the quest of Jesus in stages, as Jesus learns early on from a prophet, from John the Baptist, that he has to defeat the four powers. So that adds a little bit of a fantasy element to the story, but I think it's actually genuine. Paul talks about, we fight against principalities and powers. And if you look, that is all through the New Testament, the notion that our battle is against powers. So Jesus is told he has to defeat the four powers. And we know theologically, for the last 2,000 years, theologians have insisted that Jesus did, in fact, defeat four powers. He defeated sin, He defeated Satan, he defeated death, and he defeated religion. Those are the four powers Jesus defeated. Okay, so the question is, what did that look like? What does it mean to defeat death? What does it mean to defeat sin or Satan? What do we mean by Satan? What do we mean by death? What do we mean by sin? And what do we mean by religion? So again, I have no guarantees that I will get it right. What I want to do is just, stimulate thought on this so that maybe someone else can get it more right. We don't have to be perfect here. But I do think that there are some deep themes in the Gospels that I'd like to explore.
Well, that's perfect. I think too often we hold up novels and fiction as though it has to be 100% accurate, as though it's a science book, a science textbook.
Right.
But you're right. If fiction is all about stimulating thought and kind of wondering and imagining and speculating, and that is a good thing, not because it could lead us away from the truth, but it could lead us deeper into the truth. And sometimes we have to take those risks and say, well, maybe it happened like this, and then we get to really dig into it deeper.
I'm almost tempted to jump the gun and go ahead and do that podcast episode we have planned, Zach, exploring the purpose and the definitions and expectations of biblical fiction, because that may be, I would say that in terms of genre, that may be my second love after all the fantasy genres, sci-fi and such. It's such a promising and rewarding form of story. And Randy, you mentioned that the Gospels can seem very fragmented. That's because of the expectations of the genre. If you pick it up and expecting an exact point A to point B linear progression of the ministry of Jesus, well, even then things are going to be very fragmented because that's how real life runs. But that's not the purpose of the gospel writers, who have their own emphases in mind of what to emphasize about the ministry of Jesus. Like Matthew, for example, famously really likes the Jewishness of Jesus and those kingdom motifs and the kingdom of heaven. Right. Mark really likes the speedy moments, the immediacy of the thing, and Luke likes the emphasis on helping the marginalized and the oppressed, and John just really likes the idea of the Son of God and the light and all those all the symbols, and John is even more thematic, choosing a specific amount and a specific set of miracles to emphasize. So you got to know the difference between the gospel writer's purposes and then the purpose of a Christian author who is adapting the story or exploring other fictional aspects worked in alongside the historical events. And so it's not about just reenacting the gospel blow by blow, but not contradicting what is there, and understanding that God's word is sufficient. But we do have room to imagine what might have happened with Jesus or with his followers or with anyone else, like, Judah Ben-Hur or someone who's a fictional character inserted into that universe.
Yeah, there's deep themes here. The Gospels open up a whole lot of questions that they don't answer, and theologians have been working on those for another 2,000 years since then. What does it mean to say Jesus is God incarnate? What does it mean? What does the atonement mean? How does that work? People have been wrestling with that for 2,000 years, and it's still hard. It's still hard. So I think that there's room for, a novelist to sit there and spin out a few stories and jiggle people's neurons, as I like to say.
Yeah, and Randy, when we were talking offline earlier this morning, you said to me that stories keep us alive. Can you tell me more about what you meant by that?
Right. I actually came up with that idea a few years ago. I was speaking at at a writers' conference for romance writers in New Zealand, and so they asked me to talk about the future of publishing. I go, I don't know anything about the future of publishing, and they want me to talk for an hour on it. What am I going to say? So it finally occurred to me that I should think about the past of publishing. What is the past of story? What has story done for humanity over the ages? So I realized that in our ancient past, we had people living in small villages, and so I told this story to the romance writers in New Zealand about a tiger hunt, or I think it might have been a lion hunt at the time. But so the village is threatened by a tiger. Okay, and so they go out. They know exactly what they need to do. They need to surround the tiger, and then the tiger is going to try to break out of the circle, and he is going to attack the weakest link in that circle. He's going to look for the weakest man. And so I told the story from the viewpoint of the youngest man in the village. He's just come of age. He's small, he's weak, and he's terrified because he knows that the tiger is going to come for him. But he also knows exactly what he must do. When the tiger comes from him, the last thing to do is to turn and run, because the tiger will attack you, kill you, and then escape. And then the tiger will continue ravaging the village. The thing to do is face the tiger. And how does he know that he must face the tiger? He didn't learn it in tiger hunting school. He learned it in story. He's heard 1,000 times from the village story woman the tale of the tiger. He has lived the story of the tiger hunt from the point of view of the hunter. And he knows that he must face the tiger. When the tiger is as close as possible, he must throw his spear, and he will either kill the tiger or not kill the tiger. He may die or he may live, but he must face the tiger. He must face his deepest fears, stand up to the tiger, and take his best throw. And in this particular telling of the tale of the tiger, he kills the tiger. And at the end of the story, everyone is celebrating. They're feasting. They've skinned the tiger. They bring the tiger skin and put it on our hero. And then the village story woman tells the tale of the tiger. And as he listens to the tale of the tiger, he realizes that, yes, I killed the tiger, but it's not only me who killed the tiger. Also, the entire village killed the tiger. They participated. Also, the village story woman killed the tiger by telling so many times this tale of the tiger. But there's something else that killed the tiger, and this is really deep. The tale of the tiger itself killed the tiger. The tale of the tiger worked its way into our hero's brain so that he had the emotional muscle memory. When push came to shove, when the tiger was 3 feet away, he didn't turn and run. He had lived that story so many times. He had the strength to face the tiger and to kill the tiger. That is what story does for us. It teaches the tribe how to thrive. It teaches the tribe how to survive. And you may live or you may die when you face your tiger, but the tribe will live on because you follow what the tale of the tiger has taught you over and over and over to do. That's what story does for us. It gives us the emotional muscle memory to do the right thing.
Well, and in a biblical context, what you're referring to, there's a word actually that Jesus uses. It's called discipleship. It is training one another in these stories, although the only difference in the Christian faith is these stories are 100% true. They not only through believing them redeem us and set us on that course to becoming like Jesus and staying holy and joining with one another and loving Jesus more than our sin, but then we're able to spread those stories to others and have our behavior changed, our whole sense of the world.
Right.
Randy, I meant to ask you, saw that you can't predict the future of publishing, but you can probably slightly more reliably predict your future of publishing now that you've got this 4-book series coming out. Crown of Thorns, book 1. What was the title of that again?
Son of Mary.
All right. Do you have a title for book 2?
Yeah.
Release?
So the 4 books will be Son of Mary, Son of David, Son of Adam, and Son of God.
So biblical. That's amazing.
And in each of those, Jesus takes on one of the 4 powers. And I'll let you guess whether he wins or loses.
I can probably guess there. Or we're going to have words, brother.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. One of the things that Jesus learns in this series is the incredible power of story itself to change people. And so he uses story more and more. You know, we read in the Gospels and there's this little parable and it's like 8 verses. And we go, whoa, that's over in 2 minutes. What was he talking all day to people when he was feeding the 5,000? Did he just tell these 2-minute stories? My hunch is he told these stories in much more expanded versions. And we just have kind of the cliff notes of the cliff notes. Okay, so I think that he told much longer, much more interesting stories than the ones that we have.
And variations on the same stories, which explains some of those conflicts that people come up with. Oh, it sounds different here. It's like, he told it twice, and he changed it up a little bit to keep people on their toes.
So actually, in my novel, I tend to take some of those stories and expand those out in various ways, or I show how they may have evolved, because he probably reused stories. He probably told the same stories hundreds of times, often in slightly different contexts. And that's what we do. If you have friends, if you've talked to them long enough and heard them talk long enough, you know all their stories, right? And you know that they never tell it the same way twice. Jesus, we're all human. We're not robots. We reuse our same material over and over again. I think Jesus did too.
Well, it's the same thing with the gospel writers, because even though everything in there Christians believe is inerrant, they're going to have different emphases and they're going to tell things in a different order. And a lot of those conflicts that we think or that we hear might be in the gospels can be explained simply by acknowledging the humanity. There's going to be different ways that the gospel writers tell things. It's still true. It's just told a little bit differently and in a little bit different order. Our thanks again to Randy Ingermanson for joining us to explore not only his foray into science fiction, but his first love of that first century thriller fiction. You can find out more about Randy at www.ingermanson.com. Check out that Crown of Thorns series, starting with the novel Son of Mary. And join us again for our regularly scheduled episodes on Fantastical Truth from Lorehaven as we continue to seek and find fantastical truth.